Picture this, okay? It's June 2006. The regular football season has come to an end. Champions have been crowned and trophies have been lifted all across Europe. But football doesn't stop here. Those star players you've been watching all season are back. Only this time, they won't be playing for their clubs. No Barcelona, no Arsenal, no AC Milan, no Bayern Munich. Instead, they'll be playing for something much bigger. For their flags, for their people, for their place in history. Welcome to Germany 2006. This is the FIFA World Cup, and you're listening to it all on Football Flashbacks. It's been 4 years, 48 months, 1,461 days, and 208 weeks since Brazil lifted the title in South Korea and Japan. And now, this time around, the world's biggest sporting event returns. But however, this time around, it will be in Europe's biggest footballing nation. Of the 198 teams that attempted to qualify, only 32 will be staying in Germany for 4 weeks, with one objective in mind: to become world champions of 2006. However, they have to all start in the group stages, and especially we'll start in Group A with the opening game typically, and it'll be for the first time in World Cup history that the opening game will not feature a defending champion, unlike previous World Cups, but instead it will feature Germany, who are the hosts nation, packed with superstars like Lukas Podolski, Miroslav Klose, Philipp Lahm, Oliver Kahn, Kevin Karani, and Bastian Schweinsteiger ready to take on Costa Rica in front of 66,000 people watching in the stadium and millions more watching at home or in bars. And it didn't take long for Germany to start things underway, as within 6 minutes of the game, Philipp Lahm curled a shot past Costa Rican keeper Jose Borras to give Germany the lead and to make an entire nation of 8 million people stand up on their feet, shouting "Tor," which means goal in German. However, their lead didn't last long, as Costa Rica then equalized through Paulo Wanchope, formerly of Manchester City. But then Germany's lead was restored through Miroslav Klose, but then Costa Rica scored again, and then afterwards, Germany would score 2 more goals to finish the game 4-2. And their reputation of being a host nation continued as they beat Poland 1-0 through a last-minute goal, before beating Ecuador 3-0 through the deadly duo of Miroslav Klose and Lukas Podolski. And they would end the group with a 100% record. Speaking of Ecuador, they too would also be joining Germany in the round of 16 following their victories over Poland and Costa Rica. Let's find out what happens in Group B, as England, coming into this World Cup, had what you could say the most stacked team of the tournament. So just imagine this, okay? In goal you have David James, Rio Ferdinand, John Terry, and Gary Neville filling up the defense. Then in midfield you got Steven Gerrard and Frank Lampard, and the front three with Michael Owen, Wayne Rooney, and David Beckham. So, you just by looking at this team, you think, wow, they've got the best players. Surely they should win a World Cup, as they haven't done so in over 40 years. So, can 2006 be the year that football comes home? Well, we'll have to find out. But their group campaign did get off to a good start, though, as they beat Paraguay 1-0 before beating debutants Trinidad and Tobago 2-0. Speaking of Trinidad and Tobago, they were the ones who had the most international respect of the group, as they drew with Sweden in their first game in the World Cup. A team led by former Manchester United player Dwight Yorke. However, England would then face Sweden in their last game. And this was a game where Joe Cole scored one of the greatest goals in the World Cup, beating the Swedish keeper with a long goal from outside the box. However, Sweden would score twice after England scored, and it would end in a 2-2 draw. And speaking of Sweden, they too also joined England in the round of 16, a team full of superstars like Zlatan Ibrahimovic and veterans like Ljungberg and Henrik Larsson. Let's go over to Group C, where Argentina got off to a good start against Ivory Coast, who are the debutants, as they managed to win 2-1 in their first game. Meanwhile, the Netherlands, packed with superstars like Robin van Persie, Ian Robben, and Mark van Bommel, got off to a winning start against Serbia and Montenegro. However, speaking about Serbia and Montenegro, though, they had two problems going into this World Cup. First of all, in politics, the country was originally split up 5 days before the tournament even started on the 4th of June 2006 as Montenegro voted to stay away from Serbia. And then in the end, the country dissolved to splitting up into what we know today as Serbia and Montenegro, respectively. And the second problem was that in their next game against Argentina, what happened next was truly embarrassing, as they ended up losing 6-0, with Argentina scoring one of the team goals of the tournament's history through Esteban Cambiaso, and a young Lionel Messi scoring his first World Cup in a defeat so embarrassing that it basically knocked out the country out of the World Cup. And even though they did try to fight back against Ivory Coast, it was too little too late. Both teams were already out of the World Cup. And Argentina finished on top, joined by... the Netherlands finished on top, joined by Argentina in the round of 16. And moving on to Group D, where Portugal got off to a winning start against Angola. Portugal's team, like their squad had the same squad as they did when they finished the European Championships in their own home ground, runners-up. So they still had the players. They had Luis Figo, they had Cristina, they had Deco, and also Ricardo as their keeper. But at the same time, they also had a young Cristiano Ronaldo waiting to break the scene for Portugal in his first World Cup, and he did so following a penalty against Iran in their next game, before winning in their final game 3-0 to top the group with a 100% record. Meanwhile, this was the first World Cup for Angola, which had star player Flavio, so yeah. And Mexico also joined Portugal in the round of 16, especially since they had star players like Champions League winner with Barcelona, Rafa Marquez, and Xenia, and also adding the fact that last year in the Confederations Cup they were a fourth place team. So yeah, it's good for them. Now moving on to Group E, where Italy also had a stacked team. They had the likes of Andrea Pirlo, Francesco Totti, Vincenzo Iaquinta, Pippo Inzaghi, Gennaro Gattuso, Alessandro Nesta. Unfortunately, no Paolo Maldini for them because he was still old, even though he was playing for AC Milan at the time. And also Gianluigi Buffon, and also Marcello Lippi as their manager. And surprisingly enough, interestingly, most of their team that played in the 2006 group stages, in fact, almost everyone in the squad were playing in Serie A, which just shows how peak Serie A was at that time. However, at the same time, there was a problem as the Serie A was being investigated for match fixing, as several clubs were accused of paying referees and corruption, especially Juventus. So let's just hope nothing bad happens to them. Anyways, they got off to a good start against Ghana, with Iaquinta going around the keeper. However, in their game against the United States, even though Gilardino managed to do that iconic violin celebration when he scored first against the United States, they had to share the spoils as they drew with the USA. However, they did beat the Czech Republic in their next game and finished top of the group. But the surprising thing about this group is that the debutants Ghana also went into the round of 16, packed with stars like Asamoah Gyan and Stefan Apia. They went to the round of 16 after beating the Czech Republic 3-0, I think, on their final day. Moving on to Group F, where Brazil were the defending champions, as spoken earlier, and they had a stacked team, let me tell you. Ronaldinho, Roberto Carlos, Ronaldo Nazario, Juninho. Those were the kind of players who literally and some of them would go on to would play. This could be their last World Cup. But anyways, this team was stacked. Adriano, Julio Cesar, Zé Roberto. Like, this was a team you'd bet your entire life savings on. And also add Kaká to that as well. And speaking of Kaká, he did score, I think, his first World Cup against Croatia, which is one of the goals of the tournament, before they beat Australia 2-0 to secure their place in the round of 16. However, there was this one game against Japan which proves that you should not score too early. Don't celebrate too early against the Seleção, especially if they're world champions, because what Japan did when they scored is they just celebrated like they won the World Cup. And then afterwards, they got a 4-1 beating with Ronaldo Nazario becoming the World Cup's all-time joint leading goal scorer of all time. And who joined them in the round of 16 in Group F? Australia. Now, Australia, listen to this. Australia were entering their first World Cup in 32 years. So, yeah, this was a time to show that listen here, we are back. We just beat Uruguay in that dramatic penalty shootout. Now we're here to prove ourselves on the world stage. And prove themselves on the world stage. They did. They beat Japan 3-0, I think. When Tim Cahill scored their first goal in World Cup, in their first ever goal in the World Cup. Even though they lost to Brazil, but then they had to beat Croatia in order for them to go to the round of 16, and they did so. However, for Croatia, there was a problem though. The referee who was officiating the game, Graham Paul, gave one of Croatia's players 3 yellow cards before sending him off. It was literally so bad that FIFA literally removed him for the rest of the World Cup, and then he probably will never ever referee in a World Cup game again. So yeah. Moving on to Group G, and Switzerland were returning back to their first World Cup since, I think, 1994. And their opening game was against France. Now, about France, in the last World Cup, they were literally embarrassing, as going into the tournament, they were the defending world champions. They were supposed to top the group at least, but instead they finished bottom of the group and lost to Senegal, which is just absolutely disgusting. But at least they would manage to redeem themselves by winning the Confederations Cup a year later. However, in 2004 at the Euros, they went out of the quarterfinals to eventual champions Greece, which was so bad for them that Zinedine Zidane retired from the national team. However, he made his decision a year later to come out of retirement. And since he announced his retirement from football after the club season, the FIFA World Cup will be his special swan song, as this will be his last ever World Cup. So, can he help France win the World Cup? Can France do it for their player, who's been with them for a long time? The player who still thinks that he still has what it takes to become the best player in the world. Well, they started out with a 0-0 draw against Switzerland before drawing 1-1 against South Korea, a game in which Zinedine Zidane was sent off, apparently. And if Togo did not win, that game against South Korea would have been his last World Cup game. In fact, not just his last World Cup game, his last in professional football. But luckily, thanks to goals from Patrick Vieira and Thierry Henry, they managed to book their ticket into the round of 16 alongside Switzerland, who surprisingly were also very good. They didn't even concede a single goal, not even against France, so that was good. And yeah, this was the World Cup where Togo made their debut as well. And last but not least, ending off with Group H, and Spain, who had very good players going into this World Cup. Fernando Torres, Xavi, Iniesta, Raúl, Fernando Morientes. They believed that this year could be our year. We could win this World Cup. And it looked to be going well for them, as they actually won all their group games, in fact. I don't know if they beat Saudi Arabia, but they did beat Ukraine 4-0, who are making their debut, and Tunisia. And speaking of Ukraine, they were making their debut at the World Cup, especially led by AC Milan striker and future Chelsea player Andriy Shevchenko, who was the Champions League top scorer. He helps Ukraine in qualify for the round of 16, especially since they beat Saudi Arabia 4-0, which is quite impressive. And they also beat Tunisia as well. And so that does it. That's it. That's everything the 2006 group stage had to offer. From Germany topping their group with a 100% record, especially as a host nation, to Joe Cole scoring one of the goals of the tournament, to Serbia-Montenegro losing so badly against Argentina that they were single-handedly eliminated from the World Cup, and much more. And yeah, that's it, I guess. The World Cup group stage had a lot to offer. Football forums like Big Soccer and Red Win were filled with comments of who's going to win the World Cup and whatnot. Nokia phones were being bombarded with messages of goals, notifications, and whatnot about the World Cup. And yeah, that does it for the World Cup. 16 teams go through. 16 teams have been eliminated, and now we enter the business end, the knockout stages, specifically the round of 16, where for all the nations involved, every game feels like a final. And so, next week, we'll be talking about everything that happened in the 2006 World Cup round of 16. Everything. So, make sure you stay tuned for that. And that's it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure you like and subscribe to the ECLIPSE Sports Network. And I'll see you next week. For myself, Savage61, it's goodbye.